Okay, some of the questions. I know we've had questions coming in. I see my Bubby sitting there staring at me. James is actually training for an Ironman and wants to know how to fuel, when to refuel, and how to refuel to make it through the whole full Ironman.
Awesome. So nice to meet you, James. The introduction is that you've had so you've been working out for years. Tell me how long ago some of those milestones were met, just so I can.
I've been following your program for since about December. Prior to that, we've tried numerous different remedies, I guess you could say. Nothing really worked well for us for an entirety or for a length of period. So we've been doing your program since December, had great results, no issues with that at all. We've done 872s and then cycled back to kind of start over, and we're going to build back up to a 72. That's kind of where we're at right now today. With exercise stuff, always been kind of in shape for the last probably 10 years, I guess. Signed up to do it's a half Ironman in Augusta, Georgia, in September. So we're about 6 months out. Now I'm getting into the how to refuel during an 8-hour exertion, because it takes about 8 hours to do a half Ironman. So during that 8 hours, normally it's a high carb, high sugar type intake. While you're doing that, of course, my body doesn't respond well to that now, because it's zero carbs, or we're usually right around between 10 and 12 carbs a day. So we're pretty steadfast on making sure that we meet that goal for ourselves. So the problem I'm running into is to figure out how I'm going to be able to refuel during that time period.
Well, so it's a great question. They're probably pretty advanced for most of the other people, but I'm happy to enter into the discussion. So first of all, a couple of things. If you look for the research on this, the Ohio State, aren't you? You're from Ohio? Yeah. Okay.
Yes,
the ma'am. Ohio State is the ones with the most data on this. And let me think of the name of the researcher. Okay, Gary Taubes is not. He's the like journalist, but it'll come to me. Just give me a minute when I'm not trying to focus on it so hard about the name of the person who leads all this research. But anyway, he studies athletes. And I always like to tell one of the first things that he was able to prove was when he started working with long distance runners, they do the 100-mile race, where they start the race in the middle of the night in hopes that they, I mean, it's like, I want to say that it's like 30 some hours that they run for.
I actually have a good friend that does that.
Okay, so what's a typical 100-mile run last?
It's 30 to 35 hours, depending on the runner.
Okay, it's longer than a day, right?
Yes. Oh,
so
yes.
So he had this theory that if you were fueled by fat instead of fueled by carbs, you would have a higher performance. And one of the first places they tested it out was this 100-mile run. So he had a few athletes that had been in ketosis for a few weeks, and other ones that had been in ketosis for, I think, just under 4 months, like 3.5 months is when they ran their race. Now there was another set that was 18 months keto adapted, and we'll get to that in a second. But those first two outperformed everybody. They were the top of the leaderboard, were the people that were keto adapted. But the ones that were the 3.5 to 4 months keto adapted shaved so much time off of the race that it was the first photograph that had light at it, because they usually came in after sunset, that they were so much ahead of schedule that they took a picture of the winning moment. And the most remarkable part is it's the first photograph of this that's ever been during daylight. I mean, it was so many hours they shaved off of the race. And of course, part of that is the access to run a muscle is not just that the glucose is there to be delivered to the muscle. Once you run, get to that extreme level of exercise, you use up your glucose storage. Yep, you're going to break down muscle. You're going to break down anything for fuel to keep going. But the rate at which you can contract those muscles is much smaller. The beauty is that it doesn't take a lot of fat to produce the calories to sustain that energy level. However, you look at some of the elite athletes that, I mean, they're like they want to win the CrossFit games. Actually, I don't know about CrossFit games, but they want to win these endurance. I think they're mostly bike cyclists where they exercise for like, again, 30 hours is a typical race. Like, I don't know where these people come from, but they like this. And what the people at, I just had his name on the tip of my tongue too. What the people in this research study looked at was replacing their fuel with ketones. The first kind of round of ketones that they used as their fuel replacement was the ketone salts. So that would be like beta hydroxybutyrate, which those are what most of the products those are what my products are made of, beta hydroxybutyrate. The problem is to make them in powdered form, you have to take a liquid acid, which is beta hydroxybutyric acid, and you combine it with either sodium, potassium, chloride, magnesium, so you make a salt, you take a salt and you attach it to the acid, and that's what puts it in the powder form, which is much more, transferable. You can transport it, you can take it on a bike ride, put it in your water, that kind of stuff. However, too much salt over a short period of time gives you diarrhea. So the people who are using it for short term had a pretty good response until he got into these longer term athletes. And this is where there's quite a debate out there about using something called an ester, which is a chemistry name for a ketone ester. And if you look at, a serving of BHB is probably $2 to $3 on the market for one of the salts. But if you look at a serving for the ketone esters, it's like $20 a serving. I mean, it's insanely expensive. Maybe it was in the teens, but it was between $15 and $20 per serving. Like for 5 doses of this, it was over $100. And you're like, that isn't scalable. But for these athletes, they found that was a great way to do that. So the most important part about those exercise studies was if they went to keto in short term, and then because they would see people rise into the top of that leaderboard and they're like, I want to do keto, I want to do keto, I want to do keto, because they wanted to win. But if they had transitioned to keto within just a few weeks before the race, their mitochondria were still in kindergarten. They really just had barely, gotten proficient at using a ketone. Their ability to fuel their bodies off of that energy from fat was far inferior. In fact, that brings you to the final study that looks at what did those athletes look like when they were keto adapted for 18 months. And the answer comes from a really painful thing that we do to athletes. We take a biopsy of their muscle that rumor has it they don't use lidocaine. They just biopsy the muscle. But that's what the studies report. I've never witnessed it, but apparently it's true. I see Alex there nodding his head because I'm like, I'm pretty sure this is what they did, which is they do not anesthetize them. Anyway, so they take the muscle biopsy and you look at it under the microscope. In a glucose fueled muscle, you will find lots of glycogen. In fact, as soon as the glycogen storage is empty, that glucose dependent muscle replenishes the glycogen stored in the muscle. And they do this this is what happens when you're training for a long race. When they're training, is they've learned that if they can fill those muscles more and more and more with glycogen, then they lasted longer. Okay, and that's really where most of that research had been for the previous 30 years in exercise peak performance. When you keto adapted them, if you looked at the glycogen storage versus the triglyceride storage, meaning the strings of fat that were stored inside a muscle, and they were used for they're used as fuel. They don't even turn them into ketones. It just is fatty oxidation as the fuel source. But you have to be keto adapted or fat adapted in order to use that fuel source in a muscle cell. So in those people that were glucose dependent, they had a few of those triglycerides present, and they were way off in the corner of the cell. They weren't anywhere near the mitochondria, which is the place that burns the fuel. What was near the mitochondria is a whole bunch of the glycogen or the stored glucose. All right, so now get to the 12-week people that have been adapted for that 3 to 4 month time before they did the muscle biopsy. And you could see that, oh, we've got less of the glycogen storage. We got a little bit more of the fat storage, but it still wasn't that superior. When you got to the 18 months of keto adaptation, meaning they've been training for the last 2 years, 1.5 years in a ketogenic state, inside their muscles, they had very little glycogen storage, but they had a ton of fat storage. And I don't mean just like your fat cells are full. I mean that your cell can run off of fat and the fat is right there inside the muscle. So the reason I go through that whole explanation is to say, depending on how well you've been keto adapted and how consistently you've been in ketosis, that process of delivering fuel when you need it the most, your body will never forget how to use a glucose, but it can be lazy or ill prepared for using ketones or fat as their fuel. By the only advantage that you can create is you can stuff glycogen in those cells, but you're still going to run out of fuel in a long race like that. So that's where they glucose it. Yeah, they take the gels and do all the stuff that.
Just know he's very OCD, so he doesn't waver. Like he's
very consistent.
Yeah,
well,
he's been consistent since we left last time.
Oh, that's really
So,
great.
Never misses.
Because that's really where they need to be in order to have that advantage on the race, which is how well do your cells use fat? That's where the answer lies. You can see people that what they really needed to replace during the race was they needed electrolyte replacement. They needed fluid.
Yes, ma'am.
They didn't need the fuel. It was stored inside their muscles. If they needed fuel, they added the ketone esters. And again, I wouldn't practice this during your race because some people took in those ketone esters and they just got diarrhea. I mean, their gut just wasn't ready for it. So obviously that would really ruin your race.
Well, yeah, that'd make for a long day.
So there are plenty of people who have learned to sip on the ketone ester or the ketone salts. Again, they're 1,000,000 times cheaper. And I mean that practically 1,000,000 times cheaper when you look at not just performing on them, but exercising on them and seeing if I put a little bit of ketones in my drink, what's the benefit of that is that comes with the sodium, potassium, those salts are coupled to the ketone to make the powder. So you are getting electrolytes as well as ketones when you take any of the supplements that are on the market. What I've learned is each person has a dose that really they figure out on how to dose their ketones throughout a race. Okay. But the truth is, you probably, if you're really keto adapted, there's just, unless your body fat is less than 2%, which is unhealthy. No. Right. You've got fat. You'll mobilize it. And especially if you're keto adapted and you've been practicing that, it's amazing how well they perform.
I'm usually around about 12% body fat and using the little blood thing. Now I haven't been doing the testing my blood because I've been in training for the last 2 weeks, but normally training work wise, normally I'm usually at 2.5 to 4 ketones in the morning when I wake up.
That's amazing. So yeah, you're very well keto. Your body is producing that energy from fat. Obviously you're fasted in the morning, you've been sleeping. That production of energy is a really high performance level. And that's powerful.
What level of ketones or flavor of ketones would you like me to drop on the way home? You need
whichever.
Stay stocked up. Just
the one that I think most of my athletes have told me about is that the one with the highest concentration in my brand is the raspberry. It is, but it's also very tart. And I use it for my cancer patients. I use it for people who are having seizure or brains that really need a high level of ketones very quickly. I also use it because I'm cheap. So I want a little amount of ketone powder to give me the ketones I want. So I like it for that reason. But for the people who need to sip, they're trying to test their system out.
Mhm.
And I use this a lot in my insulin resistant patients where they're like, doc, I don't make any ketones. I can't figure it out. I made ketones for the first week and now my ketones are 0.4 or 0.5. My ketones are low. My ketones are low. I'm like, yeah, you're insulin resistant. You're stuck between making too much glucose that your liver will not make ketones. And so they have lower ketones and too high of a glucose. And it would be several of the fasts that would correct that. But there's a lot of psychology and emotional things that happen when you start asking people to fast. And sometimes their metabolism isn't strong enough to fast. They start to fast and they shut down their metabolism because of what insulin has done over the years. That is the case where you say, you need to be sipping on ketones for like 2 weeks. Just trust me that having ketones in circulation sends a message to your mitochondria to produce ketones, and you're stuck. You can't make the ketones. As soon as you make the ketones, then it's going to tell your liver to make more. But you're stuck in the middle here because of what insulin has done. So when they supplement those ketones, not only does their appetite suppress, but their mitochondria within the liver make more and more ketones over time. So by the time they get done with the 2 weeks of sipping, they have charged mitochondria, especially those from their liver, and they just transition right through that insulin resistance instead of months spent. You got to be consistent. You got to be consistent. You got to be, and I say those words, I feel like a broken record. You got to be consistent. You got to be consistent. I'm like, all right, just sip on ketones. So when I have them sipping on ketones, I push them to get the cucumber lemon one because it's a much lighter flavor. There aren't as many ketones per scoop, but you pee out most of these when they first start because their body doesn't know what to do with it. It's the act of it circulating, it's signaling what happens within the liver that triggers the next step. So again, something that you would be looking at is you don't need to replace all of your fuel. You just need to know what dose you could get away with while running and not give you diarrhea. So I would push you towards the cucumber lemon flavor because of really easier on the palate and it's not so tart. And you'll see that it's the other thing that I've had some of the athletes do is they take MCT oil. Again, you do not want to practice that when you're running.
Yeah, I found that one. Yeah, I've had experience with that one.
Right. So
just leave it at that.
Right, it's real.
Yeah.
So now it is a trainable process, but I have walked many people through this that it's slow. The reason I don't have buckets that I sell of MCT oil, I have little MCT capsules and I have them bite the capsule and swallow 1. And when that doesn't cause diarrhea, go to 2. And then you get up, my husband every day, his family has a history of Alzheimer's, and we know that this is one of the best supplements for brains that have either been damaged or have a predilection for Alzheimer's, and he takes 6 of those a day. He doesn't get diarrhea. He takes them every day like clockwork, but he did not start there. And he does it because his wife tells him to.
Good husband. You got him trained well, right?
Very smart.
Good training. Okay, does that help?
Thank you.
I'll bring
Yes,
you some
ma'am.
stones and start training with them now so you don't have the poops on your race.
Okay.
I will. Thank you very much.
You're welcome. Love you both.